Welcome back, everyone. Dan Vega here, and I am continuing on my tour with new features in Spring Boot 4. Today, we're talking about open telemetry with Spring Boot. Now, I had the opportunity to sit down with Brian Clozel, a member of the Spring team, on a recent episode of the Spring Office Hours. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about open telemetry, I'll leave a link to that video in the description below. Now, one of the things I like to say is that hope is not a production strategy. Right? We can't just push our applications to production and hope everything is going to be okay. We have to have something in place that gives us information about what is going on in production. And really, one of the things that helps us with that is something called observability. Observability, the three pillars of that is really around logs, traces, and metrics. Now, observability was rewritten from the ground up in Spring Boot 3.0. That was a major theme throughout the 3.x releases. We also had a new feature come in Spring Boot 4, which was the modularization of Spring. And it was because of this work that led to what we're going to talk about today, and that is a new Spring Boot starter around OpenTelemetry. Before, if you wanted observability, you had to pull in the actuator and use all the bits from that, even if you weren't even using the actuator endpoints. Now, the actuator is still amazing. There's still a great place for that. But if you just need the observability bits, now you can include this starter and be up and running. So we're going to learn something new today. What we're going to do is we're going to start a new project, and we'll go through what this Spring Boot starter is, how to use it, and some of the different features of observability here in a Spring Boot app. So with that, I'm going to head over to my screen. I'm going to leave you with a couple of things. One, the Road to GA Spring Boot blog posts. They have been amazing. This is one of them. The Open Telemetry with Spring Boot by Moritz Halbritter. This is a really good article and an introduction. A lot of the things that we're going to cover here today. I have some source code for the things that we are going through today. github.com/danvega/ot. So you can check this out. All of my Spring Boot 4 information goes into this repo, github.com/danvega/sb4 if you want to learn more about that. Okay, so with that, we are ready to go. We are ready to get going here. So we're going to go to start.spring.io. We're going to pick Java. We're going to pick Maven. The latest version of Spring Boot, which is 4.0.1, is important to what we are going to do here today. I'll mention that as we get into it. So I'm going to say dev.danvega. We'll call this open telemetry, right? And this is just a demo showing off the open telemetry with Spring Boot features, okay? And that's fine for the package name. I'm going to use YAML. I'm going to use JDK25. And then what do we need from a dependency perspective? Well, I'm going to build out a web app. So I'm going to use the web support. I'm going to bring in open telemetry. So we see that this is new to the Spring initializer. This is publish metrics and traces in OTLP format, which is kind of the protocol. And then we'll also be able to do logs. Logs is something, again, they added a fix for this in 4.0.1, but we can go ahead and publish those logs as well and view them in something like Grafana. So I'm going to pick open telemetry. Finally, I'm going to pick the Docker Compose support. This is going to realize that, hey, you have open telemetry as a dependency. I'm going to go ahead and install the stack that you need to get up and running. So this is really nice. This makes getting started real quickly, very easy to do. I can download this. I can start running it. I can start playing with observability right away. So that's everything we need. You're going to go ahead and click generate. That will download a zip file. You can open it up in whatever IDE or text editor you're most efficient in. For me, that's going to be IntelliJ. We have what we need. What are we waiting for? Let's write some code. All right, so here we are in the application. Now I've added the README that you'll find in the final code on GitHub, which is linked in the description below, just so we could walk through some of these things as we go. Okay, so we talked about this. Spring Boot 4 introduces the Open Telemetry starter from the Spring team. What does that give you? Just add the Spring Boot starter Open Telemetry. You get automatic metrics and traces are exported via the OTLP protocol. We get some micrometer integration and vendor neutral. Why this approach? So again, there were in the article for the Road to GA that Moritz wrote, he mentioned there were 3 ways to use OpenTelemetry. You could use it with the Java agent, you could use a third-party OpenTelemetry starter, or you can use this one with the official Spring support. The key insight here is it's the protocol that matters, not the library. Spring Boot uses micrometer internally, but exports everything via OTLP to any compatible backend. Now, again, I mentioned if you want to use Spring Boot Actuator still, you can. You can still get your observability with stack with that and more. But here's a little comparison table for when you might want to choose one over the other. So I mentioned we chose Docker Compose. This is because we get the LGTM stack. This is Grafana Labs open source observability stack. The acronym stands for Loki for logs, so our log aggregation system, Grafana for visualization and dashboards, Tempo for traces. We also get distributed tracing backend out of that, and Mimir for metrics, long-term storage for Prometheus metrics, right? So when we chose that Spring Boot starter for OpenTelemetry and the Docker Compose, we got a Compose file created for us with the appropriate service. So we're using that Grafana LGTM, and this sets everything up. So this is the Grafana UI. This one is traces, one is metrics. I always get them confused. But so we have all these services ready to go. So when we start our application up, then these services will start with it. So this is nice. So we include that Spring Boot Starter OpenTelemetry. If we look at our pom.xml, we are using 4.0.1. Again, if you kind of skipped around, make sure you're on 4.0.1 because there's a fix in here for the logs. And then we have our Spring Boot Starter OpenTelemetry. We are building a web app. We use Docker Compose. And then we also, because of the modularization in Spring Boot 4, we need to make sure the appropriate tests are included. So we have Spring Boot Starter OpenTelemetry test and Web MVC. So that should really be everything that we need to get started. We have our Compose. We want to start in the application.yaml here, and we want to set up a few properties. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. So let's copy, and we'll go in here and we'll kind of talk about this. So the first thing is the tracing probability. And the default for this is 0.1, and it's probably a good default for something that we should take to production. If we're in development, we want to see this happen all the time so that we can collect these traces and metrics and kind of test them out, because we don't have high throughput here on our local machine. So 1.0 says, hey, 100% sampling, okay for development. Don't take this to production unless you are a very, very rich person, right? And then we set up our endpoints. So we say, hey, when we export these metrics or traces or logs, where are they going to? What is the collector that is going to collect them? So we see 4318 v1 metrics for our metrics. We see our export for our tracing. And then actually here is one for logging, which we're not going to do right now. We'll get into that in a little bit. I want to kind of just start with the metrics and tracing. Going to do a couple of other things here. Let's go ahead and set some log levels. I'm also going to set server shutdown to immediate. And I'm saying here are my log levels for these different things. Okay, so that's a pretty good start. Now what we need to do is create some endpoints that we can hit and kind of generate some traffic so that we can go off and see that in Grafana. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new Java class. We're going to call this the home controller, right? And this is going to be a REST controller. And then there's just going to be some endpoints in here. I think we'll just go ahead and copy pasta. And so here we go. Here's our logger. We have a home endpoint. All it does is return hello world. We have a greeting endpoint with a name. We're going to simulate some work to be a little bit slow here. And then we're going to have a slow endpoint that sleeps for like 500 milliseconds. So that is a lot of bit slow. So we just have some endpoints that we can hit. So when we start the app up, then we can do something and then we can go visualize this, right? So let's go and I'm going to create a client here in IntelliJ. You don't need to be in IntelliJ, but if you are, you can go ahead and pull this from the repo. This is just ways to go ahead and hit these endpoints. You can use curl, you can use HTTP, you can use Postman, there are GET requests, so you can use the browser. This is just a way to hit that endpoint that we created here in our home controller. Okay, so I think at this point we should be able to see everything. Let's go back to our README. So yes, this is just explaining those metrics that we created here. Why two separate configs, running the demo. So what we want to do is run the application. This automatically starts the Grafana LGTM container via Docker Compose. And what we can do is we can hit some of those endpoints, and then we can view those traces in Grafana. So Grafana is our backend. Again, you can use whatever backend you want, but we're going to go into Grafana, and there's a way to view metrics and traces and logs. We're going to view the traces and the metrics in Grafana and see them in action. So let's do that. Let's go ahead and run our application. Actually, I need to make sure Docker Compose is, or Docker is running. And it is. So let's go ahead and run our application. All right, let's go over to the browser and see if Grafana is loading, and it is. So we're not going to see anything yet. We need to simulate or actually create a couple of requests. So I'm going to go into my client here. You can, again, go into Postman or the browser. We're just going to make a GET request to that one to this one, and maybe 3 to this slow request. So if we go to our logs here, we see that those did go through. This will be important later. This actually includes the trace and the span ID. So we could use those if we need to in our backend. But we see a bunch of operations were sent. So let's go back over to Grafana. If you go on the left here, you can drill down into some of these or explore some of these. So I'm going to go in here and, oh, why did drill down? I'm going to drill down into traces. So we get this nice little representation here of the traces in our system. We see a couple here. One way I like to look at it is down here under traces. You can see the trace name. So we have get to slash greet and slash name, and then our 3 slow ones. If we click into that, we can get a representation of that request. Now, in this case, it was just a single endpoint that didn't do anything else. But imagine it going off to some database or some other service or a combination of those things. You would see that broken down here. So you can click in here. You can see some information about it. There are some span attributes. So the HTTP URL is /slow. It was a GET. It was successful. The status code was 200. You can also see some attributes here, like what is the service name? In our case, it's Hotel. The language is Java. The SDK name is OpenTelemetry. We're using version 1.5.5. So you get a whole bunch of information about this trace, which is really nice. So I'm going to close that. We can also go in and look at metrics. So if we look at metrics, you can see all of the kind of built-in metrics that Spring gives you out of the box. You can just run down here and see there's actually no data on some of the HTTP. Now there is. Okay. So you can start to see some information. Here's some JVM memory information. There are a whole bunch of metrics that you can gain built in out of the box from Spring. Now you can also go ahead and add your own metrics. There is, I believe, some examples in here, and I'll put something in the final repo. All right, so I'll show you 2 quick ways you can go ahead and add your own metrics. One is by getting access to the observation registry. So let's call that observation registry. We'll ask for it through constructor injection, and then we have our registry. So what we can do with that is we can use an observation to say create not started. We can give it a name. So maybe we're just calling this counter. We get access to the observation registry, and then we can go ahead and observe something. In this case, we're basically just performing the same functionality we did before, but with this observation, we get a little more flexibility in the things that we can do. So if you need a little bit more flexibility of creating this observation and maybe tracking key value pairs and doing some other things, you get a little more flexibility this way. This can also pollute your code if you have this in a lot of places. All right, now I like to use the annotation, but to do so, we got to bring in another dependency here. You could bring in something like aspect for J. I'm just going to bring in the spring boot starter AOP, and that should be good. So let's make sure Maven is reloaded here. Reload. Okay. So now we can go back over to the home controller, and instead of like using the observation registry, which we can now get rid of, and having to do that, we can just add an annotation here at observed. And then we can give it a name. Similarly, maybe we do home.count. And now we can go ahead and add that metric. So again, this is a nice way to add metrics on top of the ones that Spring already adds for you. These are your custom metrics. Try not to get kind of crazy with this. Be specific about which ones are important to you. Let's go back to our README and talk about logging. So we've gone through all this. We run the demo in Grafana. We can see our metrics, our traces. What do we get automatically? Let's talk about viewing the logs with trace context. So when our application starts up, the logs automatically include the trace ID and the span. So this is the trace, this is the span. Now, understanding what those are. The trace ID identifies the entire request across all services. Every log and span from a single request shares this ID. So if we have something that comes into our application and we got to spawn out and call one service, call another service, then maybe call a database as part of like a single request, we'll have a single trace, but the span ID identifies the specific operation within that trace. So that allows you to jump from trace to logs within Grafana, jump from logs to trace, and debug specific operations within like a multi-step span. Okay, so here's an example request, multi-span request. We have a request to greet world. Span A controller shows the span A's ID. This reaches out to some span B, some other service. The log shows span B's ID. When you see it in the log, span B's ID, you know it happened during simulate work, not the controller method. So this is good to know. So by default, we don't export logs via OTLP. In fact, this wasn't possible in Spring Boot 4 unless you brought in like the Spring Actuator. But now in 4.0.1, this is configured, so we can go ahead and use this. We just need to do a couple extra things. Now, I'm not reinventing the wheel here. I'm pulling this information from that wonderful article that Moritz wrote on the road to GA. So if you want to, you can dive into that. So we need one more dependency. We got to add the logback appender dependency. So I'll do that. So I'm going to come in here. We'll do that. We'll reload, go back to our README. We also need to create a logback Spring XML to add the OpenTelemetry appender. So we're going to copy this, and then in source main resources, I'll just create a logback spring.xml. And this isn't specific to this. If you're new here, you can always create a logback spring.xml by convention and kind of override the default logging if you want to. Here we have an appender called OTel, and we're using that thing we just brought in. And then at the root level for info, we are logging to the console and to this OTel appender. Finally, we need one more thing. The OpenTelemetry appender needs to know what OpenTelemetry instance to use. To do that, we can create a simple component. So I will come in here and say new Java class, and this is install OpenTelemetry appender. Okay. And then this looks like that. Cool. All right. So now the bean gets auto-configured OpenTelemetry instance injected by Spring, installs it into the logback appender after the Spring context is ready, and enables the appender to send logs to through the OpenTelemetry SDK to the OTLP endpoint. Okay. Do we have our logs? Let's go back into our application. So we want to uncomment this. So we're saying, where are you sending the logs to? This is the collector endpoint for that. And we should be good. So now what we're going to do is run our application, and we'll see if Grafana is started up. And it is, and we are in the logs, and we can see the logs being sent over to Grafana. You can go ahead and click show logs, and we have some logs. Now let's go back to our application and again open up our client.http. We'll run a few requests here, one there, and maybe 3 of these guys. And now we can go back over to Grafana and go into traces. So again, that trace ID is connected to a span ID, but this allows us to go in here and see this trace. And now Grafana knows how to connect the logs to the traces. So now we can go in here and click through this. We see this logs for this span. We see starting the slow operation, so operation completed. So again, having the logs in the one place where we're kind of viewing all of our traces and all of our metrics, and now we can kind of connect those logs to those traces is a very powerful thing. All right, there you have it. Open telemetry with Spring Boot in Spring Boot 4, 4.0.1 to be specific. But this is really good. Again, the observability story was started from the ground up in Spring Boot 3.0. We saw a lot of great enhancements there. But we needed to bring in the actuator and all of the things that come with the actuator. And maybe that's not always the case for you. And so now what we get is we get this nice Spring Boot starter for OpenTelemetry. We can pick it from the Spring initializer. We can get up and running with observability fast and easy. Really, really like this addition to Spring Boot 4, and we hope you do too. Well, I learned a lot putting this together today, friends. I hope you did too. If you did, you know what to do. Leave me a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and as always, happy coding.